Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi and today I'm going to be telling you all the books that I read during the Corona quarantine. I've not really talked at length about what I've been reading during this pandemic and during this lockdown, and it feels a little weird to have a lack of reading wrap-ups on my channel. It also feels weird to not point out the immense impact that COVID has had on my reading and also on my filming. Emotionally, I've not really been up to doing either, and doing something like a wrap-up has felt very difficult and taxing, especially as the months continue to roll on. The task just felt more and more monumentous until I finally decided, you know what, it's time to bite the bullet and give it a shot and tell you about the books that I've been reading basically from March through, I'm gonna say through August, just so that I don't completely overwhelm myself. That lets me do September, October, and November in a separate fall wrap-up later. I guess the silver lining in not doing a wrap-up in 6 whole months is that for those 6 months, I wasn't reading a whole heck of a lot. I think the most I read in a month total was like 12 books, 13 books, and that was in May. The least I read in a month was 1 single book. But regardless, I do have a lot of ground to cover, so I think it's best if we just get started. So approximately 84 years ago, in March of 2020, the first book that I read was Piecing Me Together by Renee Watson. Piecing Me Together follows Jade, a young Black teenage girl from a relatively impoverished family who is attending a really prestigious private school that is predominantly white on scholarship. Jade feels pretty isolated within her peer group. There aren't too many students at her school that she can relate to or form too close of a bond with. And she tries not to be too bothered by that because she's really here for the education and taking all the opportunities she can to move up and ahead. One of her primary goals for being such a good student is to get to use her Spanish language skills on a mission trip abroad. She hopes that she'll be nominated for this opportunity, but instead she is nominated to join a group called Women for Women. This is a mentorship program for at-risk, which is basically just code for Black and or poor young women to be paired up with older women who are in a pretty successful place. And at first, Jade does what she's always really been told to do: take every possible opportunity and say thank you for it, even if ultimately the opportunity doesn't appear to be what she needs it to be. There's no great big moment where things break bad. Ultimately, Piecing Me Together follows the story of Jade as she learns to find her voice and to demand more than the pittance that people are giving her and expecting her to call it enough. As far as something I like about this novel, I really love the characterization and the themes and how they interlinked with one another. I'm always a sucker for a story of a woman coming of age and finding her voice and finding her strength to demand the things that she deserves, and Jade exemplified that story beautifully. It broke my heart to see some of the microaggressions that Renee Watson wrote in, the things that Jade experienced that her white peers or wealthier peers didn't have to. It was a collection of small moments that were actually a lot bigger than they appeared on the surface, and they just sort of bubbled up and boiled into her until she decided no, she wasn't gonna just let it happen anymore. She was going to speak up against it. The story was a beautiful and deeply interesting exploration of the way that race and gender and socioeconomic class interplay, as well as being an exploration of how high school friendship sometimes goes and a coming of age story. And as far as things I didn't like, I can't really come up with an example. I think this was a very good and a very important story to read. I wish I'd read it when I was a little younger. I think it would have impacted me a little more strongly when I was a teenager, but even so, even as an adult, I think it was ultimately a very important story to read. After Piecing Me Together, I reread 3 Dark Crowns by Kendara Blake. And over the course of the quarantine, I also reread 1 Dark Throne and Queens of Fenburn. The series takes place on the island of Fenburn, a magical island where 3 queens are born to the ruling queen every generation. And these queens have one of a variety of gifts. They can either be poisoners, meaning they are immune to a large variety of poisons. They can be a naturalist, meaning that they have an affinity for the natural world and for animals. They can be an elemental, which obviously means they control one of the several elements. They can also be war gifted, meaning they have a mind for strategy and can do like telekinetic battle stuff. Or they can be oracle queens, which means they see into the future. Or they could have been if all of the oracle queens hadn't systemically been executed after one of them went crazy. The main series, starting with 3 Dark Crowns, follows 3 such queens, Mirabella, Arsinoe, and Catherine, as they are raised up by these varying factions on the island of Fenburn and basically trained from their early youth to execute one another until one of them can be crowned queen of the whole of the island and the cycle can start anew. One thing I love about the world of Three Dark Crowns is the political intrigue. It is truly a fantasy story where the cool powers matter far less than the sort of political minds ruling behind the throne, as it were. If you're looking for a story full of absolute subterfuge and young teenage girls basically saying, hey, fuck that, we're family and we love each other and we're not going to be ruled by your bureaucratic BS, then this is definitely the story for you. I will say Three Dark Crowns is fairly slow. It's definitely a story where things ruminate, but the action definitely picks up in One Dark Throne, and it's just such a delight to read. I can't wait to continue with the series. After Three Dark Crowns, I picked up Fairy Tales for Lost Children by Dariette Osman. This is a collection of short stories that was sent to me by a dear friend Noria from the channel Chronicles of Noria, who I will have listed in the description box below. As I said, Fairy Tales for Lost Children is a collection of short stories. The one sort of through line, stringing them all together, is that they are about queer Somali characters. It follows a variety of characters from a variety of gender expressions, a variety of ages, a variety of socioeconomic classes, and even a variety of geographical locations. Some take place in Somalia, some take place in Kenya, some take place in South London. Some of them are tragic and mournful, some of them are celebrations of identity, but all of them have this through line, wherein the identities of queerness and being Somali intersect and interplay in very similar ways despite all of these differences in external factors. Most, if not all, of the stories have something to do with family dynamics. Every single one of them has something to do with personal identity and a sense of freedom. What I love about the story is those through lines. I loved the shared dynamics that all of these stories put together had. I will say, if you're thinking about picking it up, definitely a huge trigger warning for homophobia, also trigger warning for racism. Those play heavily with all these stories, and they are very, very difficult to read about from such a personal and deep standpoint. So definitely be wary of that going in. But that just made them all the more harrowing and moving as stories to read for me, because I read them while I was in a good headspace to read about those kinds of topics. I also really like the art that is interspersed after every single story. It really did feel like a collection of fairy tales with the illustrations at the beginnings and the ends. I thought that they were beautiful visual representations of the stories that they were depicting. Absolutely stunning. And again, like the previous books, there's not much that I didn't like about this one. I had a whole lot of fun reading it, and I'm very thankful to Noria for thinking of me and sending it my way. Following Fairy Tales, I read One Dark Throne, and after that, I read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This is a debut thriller following Pippa, a high school student working on her senior capstone project. As she has an interest in journalism, Pippa decides to sort of re-examine a story from her small hometown regarding the murder and suicide of a highly popular high school girl, Andy Bell, and her boyfriend, Sal. As the story goes, 5 years ago, this deeply, deeply popular girl named Andy was murdered by Sal, her boyfriend, who then committed suicide. But Pippa doesn't really believe this to be the case. She knew Sal when he was a kid, and she doesn't believe he has it in him. So for her project, she's actually trying to sort of reopen and resolve the case and basically prove that Sal was innocent, because she saw it as a deeply mismanaged case, one that everyone just wanted to sweep under the rug. But people don't like it when their secrets are poked at, and the more that Pippa digs and the more that she finds actual compelling evidence that Sal might have been innocent all along, the more she puts herself and her family and friends in danger. I really enjoyed A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. It reminded me very, very much of this podcast I used to listen to called Serial. And the case that it followed seemed very, very much like a parallel to the case that was covered in Serial. So it was fun to sort of revisit a familiar old story, but in a completely new way. This is told in part through just narrative prose, but also partially through interviews and through journal entries. And I just thought that was a very interesting way to incorporate this mixed media, this is my capstone project element, back into the telling of the story. I will say that at times things felt greatly, deeply unbelievable, but I guess that's to be expected when the story hinges on the idea of a high schooler resolving a cold case and getting access to like police documents or, you know, the phone of a long dead woman. Additionally, at times it felt that the stakes were very, very low considering the sort of things that were being dug up. I didn't really believe that Pippa was ever in a crazy amount of danger. I figured she would get away unscathed no matter what. And I think for a story like this, putting her in slightly more immediate harm's way would have been a deeply effective way to raise the stakes. But that said, I had a whole lot of fun reading it. It was a super pacey, fast-paced book. I really enjoyed Pippa as a character, but overall this was a very enjoyable story, super fast. If you're looking for a deeply entertaining read, I would definitely pick this one up. It's not like the creme de la creme of thrillers, but it is a really, really fun story, and I believe that it's the first of a several part series, which I think is really interesting because generally speaking, of the thrillers I've read, the deeply effective ones seem to be standalone. So I'm very excited to see how Holly Jackson is going to continue weaving the threads that she sort of left loose at the end of this book through to other books. The last book that I read in the month of March was Queens of Fenburn, but before that I read Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy by Cassandra Clare, etc. This collection of short stories follows Simon Lewis, a human turned vampire, turned daylighter, which is a vampire that can walk in the sun, turned Shadowhunter, or at the very least, Shadowhunter in training. As the title suggests, it follows Simon's time in the Shadowhunter Academy. In addition to figuring out how to physically be a literal demon-slaying badass, Simon is also facing a whole lot of imposter syndrome because he's coming to terms with a life that he basically forgot. At the end of the Mortal Instrument series, Simon's memories of the entire Shadow world were taken away from him. And throughout this story and throughout his reintroduction into the Shadow world, he's slowly getting some of those memories back. But he has this entire legacy of heroism that he feels compelled to live up to and just can't. And I think that is actually the most interesting part of the series of short stories. I love seeing Simon come into his own. In the previous book, it was really hard for him to hold his own, considering he was a small and fleshy human being. He only really began to hold his own when he became, a creature of the night. But then he was frowned upon because he was a creature of the night and the Shadowhunters are racist. So now he's finally getting to become his own person, if that makes sense. It was really interesting to see who he was, divorced of the memories of Clary, divorced of his feelings about Jace, etc., but remembering what it's like to be considered second class by these Shadowhunters who he is now ironically trying to become a part of. I can't know for certain because I really haven't read too much of the series past this, but I do think that Simon's time in the Shadowhunter Academy is deeply important for how the rest of the series will go on and the reforms that need to happen in the Shadowhunters governance world. As far as things I didn't like, it's been fully 6 months plus, like 8 months, since I've read all of the books that I've talked about today, so pardon me if I'm a little rusty, but I can't remember too much. Obviously, some stories I liked more than I liked others, but overall, I think this was a fun addition to the Shadowhunters Chronicles. So those were the books that I read in the month of March. But speaking of March, in April, the first book that I read was about the March sisters. After many years of deliberating, I finally picked up Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. In truth, I'd been reading it basically piecemeal since I'd watched the movie in February, in the before times when you could still go to a movie theater and not worry about catching a deadly respiratory illness. I'm sure Little Women needs no introduction. It's a beloved classic for a reason, but in case you do need a little bit of a refresher of what it's about, Little Women follows 4 little women, the March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. It follows their lives as they quite literally grow up from young girls into little women. Through their various trials and tribulations, they're taught empathy. We get to watch them fall in love. We get to watch their hearts break. And overall, it's just a beautiful domestic story, a sort of window into the life of women at the time that Louisa May Alcott was writing this. And I think that's what I like most about it. So in reading the source material, I was surprised and pleasantly so to find that I had different points of attachment and different points of disattachment to each of the sisters. They're all deeply self-actualized characters, and it was wonderful to sort of watch how their flaws and differences brushed up against one another and created conflict. But more than that, as the oldest of 4 siblings myself, I thought it was a really honest depiction of what siblinghood looks like, especially when the sibling dynamics skew a little female. As far as things I didn't like, I will say that I felt the story felt a little long. That's not to say that I think it went on too long. I think it covered exactly the right amount of time for the story that it was trying to tell. However, I do feel that a little more dynamism wouldn't have gone amiss. And I don't mean like fight scenes or something or unnecessary conflict. I think the beauty of the story is sort of in its quietude and in the fact that it's a window into, a normal human person's life. But But I will say I wish there were, for example, more bits of dialogue so that we could see the characters interact with one another. But overall, as with the rest, I ended up really enjoying the story. It was beautiful background for the movie that I had seen. It's a fundamental work of the American literature canon, particularly by a lady author. So I am glad that I've done it. I can check that one off as a book that I've read. After Little Women, I read Tithe by Holly Black, and later throughout the quarantine, I also read the follow-up books Valiant and Ironside. If I'm not mistaken, Tithe was Holly Black's debut novel. It follows a girl named Kay Furch who lives with her single mom in the New Jersey-ish area. When Kay's mom's latest boyfriend tries to assault her mother after their band plays a show, Kay and her mom decide to move back in with Kay's grandma into the house where Kay grew up. Growing up, Kay was considered a weird kid because she would speak to fairies and make up all these stories, and people just thought she was kind of a weirdo. But when she returns home, she finds out that her imaginary friends were very much real. And as luck would have it, she's a fairy too. She's a changeling that's thought she was a human her entire life. When Kay saves the life and earns the favor of Robin, a knight of the evil Unseelie Queen, her friends concoct a plot to use Kay as bait in order to free themselves from the Queen's tyrannical rule. But being a fairy and caught up in fairy plots is a lot more than Kay bargained for, and she's in no way prepared for the dangers that she's putting herself and her family in now. Ironside is a direct sequel to Tithe, and Valiant is sort of a spin-off story following a different girl who ran away from home and fell in love with a troll. It's very cute. I love it tremendously. All I can really say about the series is that it's my fave, and I know it's a little problematic. Some elements of the story did not age super gracefully. Some of Kay's more fae-like features include upturned eyes, which, when she's in her human guise, make her appear part Japanese. Deeply uncomfortable comments are made about Kay's Asian heritage, which, yes, we know that she's not actually Asian. However, the person making the comments does not know this, and it's just a little icky. And a boy that ends up becoming one of Kay's best friend makes some deeply unsettling comments about shooting up his school. Like I said, they're my problematic faves. I love these stories. I grew up with them. They are integral to my understanding of the urban fantasy genre, and I love Holly Black so much. But looking at it from a purely objective standpoint, there's some sketch stuff that happens. After Tithe, I read Mark Oshiro's Anger is a Gift. So content warnings for police brutality, systemic racism, individual racism, some homophobia, assault, panic attacks, and general violence against children. Anger's a Gift follows Moss Jeffries, a young, gay, black man whose father was murdered by the police department. The subsequent vilification of his father by various media outlets and by the police department as a whole has left Moss with a just whole barrage of mental health issues, and after an incident involving the police at his school, Moss realizes that things are starting again. He and his classmates begin to basically be treated as criminals at their school. And the students get fed up and try to push back against the violence and intimidation being pushed upon them. But as always, when we're talking about the American Police Department, when they feel resistance, they push back, and they push back hard. After one of Moss's friends is murdered on his school grounds by the police, and he knows that the same thing that happened to his father is going to happen to his friend, Moss has to decide to use his voice and use the voices of his friends to speak out about this and get heard. As far as things I like about this book, I think it's a deeply important story to have. I think the message of anger being a gift, particularly to folks of marginalized communities, and double especially when those marginalizations intersect with yet more marginalizations, it's deeply important to give yourself permission to live loudly and not allow yourself to be cowed by the systems in place to keep you down. As far as things I didn't like, and keep in mind that as a relatively affluent white person, I am not the one who can speak to the realism of these things and the events that occurred in the book, but I will say that some of the situations that occurred in the story almost felt like a mockery of actual police brutality and systemic violence against marginalized people, but especially against people of color. So as an example, and this is a complete spoiler, I'll put my hand down when the spoiler's over. At one point in the story, a metal detector physically injures a student because he has some sort of plate, I believe, in his knee. And cops basically shove him into the metal detector, through it, and he gets like stuck to the metal detector as though it were an MRI machine. And basically he gets like deeply injured. And that just felt like almost farcical, like a like a crazy fake example of the actual real life reality of police brutality and violence against bodies of color. I just feel like the truth is probably harrowing enough, and pushing things to these like over the top boundaries cheapened the effect. So that feels like it could be a good place to pause, because I will be filming this in batches. There's simply too many books to cover all at once, but I don't want to end on a low note. So we're actually going to begin with some of the May reads, starting with the first book that I read in May, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki. This is a graphic novel about a young woman named Freddie who is deeply in love with a girl at her school called Laura Dean. The two of them have a deeply tumultuous sort of on again, off again relationship, where Freddie is deeply, deeply invested in the relationship and Laura Dean is not. Every time Laura Dean asks for Freddie back, she crawls back, and her friends cannot fucking believe it. After their latest breakup, Freddie doesn't really know who to turn to for help, so she goes to this online mystic called Seek Her for help with her relationship problems. And she's not exactly thrilled with the advice she gets, but considering the state of her life, the fact that her behavior is slowly pushing her best friends away, the fact that her romantic life has really never been worse despite getting back with Freddie, and the fact that her own dignity and self-worth is slowly being worn down, something's gotta give. So as I said, this is a graphic novel, and one of my favorite things about it was the art. I really loved that it was mostly black and white, but occasionally there were these pink accent marks that I felt drew the attention of the eye and sort of the attention of myself as a reader to the right places at the right times. I feel like the highlights were done in a very effective way, and it helped the story flow. And for the most part, I really enjoyed Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, though I will say that a problem that I often have with graphic novels is that occasionally I feel like they are overpacked. They try to do a lot and they never succeed at doing each of those things. For example, this story tried to tackle toxic relationships, and it tried to handle them both from a platonic and a romantic point of view. And if it had chosen one and stuck with that as its main theme, things might have been fine. But it also tried to cover the topic of abortion, manipulation, abuse, gaslighting, self-worth, and coming of age, all of which are enormous topics in their own right, and all of which can be interwoven relatively effectively, but not when you're using, like, I don't know, maybe 10,000 total words and mostly relying on images to carry the story. Because there was so much to introduce, the introduction of these new topics felt almost a little repetitive, and I kind of can see how that might have been an artistic choice, creating a sort of cyclical story that Freddie gets stuck in until she finally breaks free of it at the end. However, I think it could have been done in a better, more effective way that didn't sort of slow the story down. I know that I said that I didn't want to end this on a bad note, and I promise I won't. In fact, I'm going to end it on possibly the best note that I will have throughout the entirety of this review, and that is with Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert, which is perhaps my favorite book of 2020. Chloe is anxious and chronically ill, and because of this, she likes to live her life in a relatively routine and structured way, because at least that way, she knows what she's getting into and she can keep herself and her body safe. But when she is almost hit by a car, she realizes that all of her plans aside, life is still gonna happen no matter what, and Chloe hasn't exactly lived hers to the fullest. After this incident, she makes what she calls her Get a Life list, basically a bucket list of stuff she does not want to exist having not quite done. And topping the list is moving out of her family's home and into her own flat. Unfortunately, her new flat also comes with the stubborn and unfairly gorgeous apartment supervisor, Redford Morgan, who Chloe absolutely does not have feelings for, but who, she's pretty sure, can help her get a couple things done on her list. She wants to ride a motorcycle, and Red has a motorcycle, so... And the story really goes from there. I don't want to tell you any more about it because I want you to read it and I want you to fall in love with it and these two characters as much as I have. Right off the bat, I'm going to say there's nothing I didn't like about the story. I think it was done absolutely beautifully. But as far as things I did like, I'm going to focus on one thing that I loved absolutely most about the story, and it is the relationship dynamic between Chloe and Red. You guys know that I'm a sucker for the enemies to lovers trope, and in the contemporary sphere that means rivals to lovers more often than not, and these two definitely started as that. They're both such huge personalities that look like they would clash on the surface, but as they get to know one another and move past each other's prickly exteriors, they really get to the core of what one another values and cares about, and they find that they have more in common than not. I think it was really beautiful to sort of watch Red help Chloe come out of her shell and help her achieve her goals of growing without ever pushing her in one direction too hard. It also made me very happy to see that he wasn't pushy or like fixer-uppy about her chronic illness or her anxiety. He let her set her limits because obviously she knows her body and mind better than anyone else, and he respected them and never pushed them. Nor did he view himself as a white knight who was saving this woman or doing her some enormous favor. He values her as a person and respects her, and it's just fucking delightful. In a similar vein, I really enjoy how tender Chloe is to Red. We don't often get men in fiction who are allowed to be vulnerable and the victims of abuse, and Red's previous relationship messed him up on a deeply, deeply emotional level, and I'm really pleased with how that was dealt with in this book. I'm really pleased with how Chloe, again, didn't try to fix him, but wanted to give him the tools and resources to help himself with this problem. Their mutual respect is my absolute favorite part of the story, is that neither of them thinks that they know better than the other. They both just want to help the other thrive, and it makes me so happy. Following Get a Life, Chloe Brown, I read The Two Towers, Part 2 of the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm buddy reading this series with my friends Kara, Katie, and Kelsey, all of whom I'll have linked in the description box below. I feel like The Lord of the Rings really is a story that needs no introduction. You've either read it or seen an adaptation, or at the very least heard about it in some way. It's very much a pop culture icon that has sort of shaped how fantasy stories look like today. But in case you are unfamiliar, I'm going to keep it very, very short by doing the most bare bones of explanations and telling you that The Lord of the Rings predominantly follows a hobbit named Frodo who is tasked to destroy a ring that basically contains the soul of the great big bad of his world and of his time. To do this, he goes on an adventure with several of his other hobbit friends, a wizard, several humans, an elf, and a dwarf, and they go off on their way to destroy this ring, prevent a bunch of wars, fight some wars since some wars aren't preventable, and basically save the world. The Lord of the Rings is also one of those comfort stories for me where it's absolutely one of my favorite things in the world, so it's not really fair to talk about what I like versus what I don't like about it. I will say that what I noticed more during this read-through is the half of the book that takes place following Frodo, Sam, and Gollum. The Two Towers is my favorite of the trilogy, and I usually like it because of the Merry Pippin storyline and because of the Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli storylines and how those intertwine. I'm a huge fan of the introduction of the Rohirrim and that whole part of the world building, as well as the Battle of Helm's Deep, etc. But on this read-through, I was deeply, deeply moved by Gollum as a character in particular. Gollum might be my favorite character ever written, like point blank. He's just so interesting to me. He's not a good person, but he's also not wholly bad. There's a part of him that I believe wants to be good and that wants to look at Frodo and see Frodo carrying this burden that he carried for thousands of years and wants to see Frodo succeed. There's a part of him that calls soul to Frodo, and I think that were that feeling nurtured, I think that the story could have gone very, very differently. It was fascinating and deeply heartbreaking to see Gollum ultimately turn toward the evil half of himself and choose to put himself down that road. If the story was told from Gollum's point of view, The Lord of the Rings would very much be a tragedy, less than an epic fantasy story. And I think it's a really, really fascinating character study that we get to see in this book. And that is one takeaway that I am exceedingly glad I got to have, surrounded by friends who are as passionate about the story as I am. After The Two Towers, I read All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. This is a memoir basically chronicling George's life growing up as a Black gay man. George Johnson calls this a memoir / manifesto because in addition to being a story about his life and his struggles growing up to accept both his Blackness and his queerness, it sort of acts as a rallying cry to other young men in his same situation who maybe don't have the role models that he also lacked in his youth to sort of shepherd them through this identity that's so increasingly difficult to navigate, especially in the United States. I always struggle to review memoirs because they just feel so personal that a critique of them always feels like a critique of the writer. And in this story especially, I feel like I have no business and no place critiquing any part of it, nor do I feel it's my place or that I have the inherent knowledge base or understanding of a story such as this, a life such as this, to be able to effectively say like what I like and what I didn't like in a way that doesn't automatically feel cheap and sort of voyeuristic, if that makes sense. I will say from a technical standpoint, I think that it was very directly written. It was very much written to the audience that this was intended towards. Not too many memoirs are aimed toward a YA audience, so I feel that the slightly more simplistic language and the direct nature of George M. Johnson's tone throughout the story was a deeply important and effective way of getting across the points he wanted to get across. Additionally, the prose that he used There were so many quotable moments, so many beautifully written pieces of English language that I didn't have a physical copy of this while I was reading it. I listened to it on audiobook because George M. Johnson narrates it himself. And I really enjoyed hearing him say some of these things. I would play back certain passages just because they were so powerful and they hit me so close to home. And like most memoirs, I can't really call this good or bad, but I can call this important and urge you to read it. This urging is especially important toward my white viewers. We are living at a time when it is more critical than ever to develop your empathy toward people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people of color. Following that, I read The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is the first of the Witcher books. Specifically, The Last Wish is a collection of short stories set in the Witcher verse prior to the official book 1 of the novel series. And it sort of acts as a prequel/introduction to our main characters that we follow throughout the story, specifically Geralt of Rivia, the eponymous Witcher, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that I enjoyed the stories so much more on this second read through. In addition to enjoying the parallels between some of the stories and certain events that happened in the Witcher TV show that I then got to visualize a little more clearly whilst reading, I particularly enjoyed the characterization of Geralt so much more in the books this time around. He's definitely got that sort of gruff thing going, but the Geralt of the books is also far more comfortable and aware of his standing as kind of a badass, more so than Henry Cavill's interpretation of The Witcher in the show. On the other hand, the Geralt of the books is far more vulnerable and frequently gets his butt handed to him. I think it's a really important thing to establish early on, is that your protagonist is not invulnerable, and Andrzej Sapkowski did that very, very well in these books. As far as things I didn't like, as with the first read, there was some like misogyny light that's sort of to be expected with these like vaguely medieval inspired old European fantasies. I'm never a fan of ladies being treated as props. We did get some notable exceptions. I might have felt a little better if we had similarly not super sexualized, but like underdeveloped male characters as well. But of the men we focused on, most of them had a little more to them than the women that we focused on did. But ultimately, I think The Last Wish was a very, very great introduction to these characters, and I will be reading The Blood of Elves very, very soon. After The Last Wish, I read Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. This book really follows families more than it follows individual characters. It follows the Richardsons. This family sort of represents the ideals of Shaker Heights and suburban Americana. Everything has its place, everything is neat, and Elena Richardson loves to butt her nose into people's business and make sure that things are neat in the way that she believes is right and good. On the other hand, you have the Warrens, a single mother and her daughter who could not be more different from Elena's prescriptive ideals. Mia is an artist who doesn't stay in the same city very, very long at all. She and her daughter Pearl end up renting a home from the Richardsons, and their quirky, artistic, more laissez-faire style of life very much appeals to the Richardsons' 4 children who had lived a relatively sheltered lifestyle up until that point, and even draws in, kind of against her own will, Elena. The conflict really comes to a head when the Richardsons' family friends attempt to adopt a Chinese-American baby who Mia finds out wasn't entirely willingly given up by its mother. A custody battle erupts, drawing lots of media attention and negative press and sort of warring on both sides of these factions. And it truly drives a wedge between Elena and Mia, causing Elena to dig deep into Mia's past to find out anything she can about her to discredit her point of view. I feel like I just gave a relatively in-depth synopsis, but I haven't even scratched the surface of everything that this story covers. But because I still have a lot of books to get into, I think that what I'll leave it with is, as far as things I liked about this novel, I really like the discussions on motherhood, and specifically what it means to be a good mother and how one can be a good mother versus a bad mother. We get to explore this question not only with the custody battle between these white, super affluent would-be parents of this baby who could undoubtedly provide it with more financial support and better opportunities, if you will, throughout its life, versus the baby's poor immigrant working class mother who for sure can't provide it with the financial support the baby will need, but who is possibly the only one who can offer to the child a specific cultural context and an understanding of her identity that her would-be adoptive parents have no way of doing, and it appears no interest in doing. But on a more close level, since we actually get to interact with these characters and sort of live inside their heads a little better, we also see this dynamic between Mia and Elena. It's my belief that both Elena and Mia have failed tremendously as mothers and as parents. Elena by suffocating her children and trying to put them into these black and white categories and little cookie cutter boxes of suburbia and trying to mold them into what she believes is the ideal of a child and the ideal of a person. Much like her family friends, she's providing them with financial support and the ability to provide for themselves within the context of this community, but she's not providing them with the emotional warmth and the ability to express themselves as individual people. On the other hand, you have Mia, who is essentially a neglectful parent to Pearl. We hear a lot of lip service about how much she loves Pearl and would do anything for her, but at the same time, Pearl is sort of left to her own devices. She does so much that Mia is either completely unaware of, or if she's aware of it, doesn't react to. And as such, you get these children who are deeply, deeply emotionally stunted on either side and who cling to one another and cause some conflict, but really I feel like the story is about the adults. Either way, it's a deeply, deeply interesting story, and all of these adult women, these adult mothers in it, are flawed and good in their ways and bad in some other ways, and it's just a wonderful exploration of female characters in particular, and I think that's why I was so drawn to it. As far as things I didn't like, I feel like the end was a little tame. I don't feel that it concluded the story as effectively as I would have liked it to. Following that, I reread like an old childhood favorite, The Lightning Thief, the first book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series by Rick Riordan. This book series follows the eponymous Percy Jackson, a demigod who is the son of a human mother and the Greek god Poseidon. Growing up in the mortal lands, Percy got himself into a whole bunch of trouble and never understood why the whole world seemed to be against him. Until one day when he was 12, the monsters of the outside world finally caught up to him, and he realized that the only place that he would be safe is with other demigods such as him at a place called Camp Half-Blood. But as it turns out, Percy isn't quite safe even in the safe haven for people like him, and he is thrust onto an adventure, a quest, if you will, to retrieve the stolen lightning bolts of Zeus, who believes Percy himself to be the thief. I am a sucker for fantasy, and that includes mythologies and fairy tales and folklore from all over the world. I really credit my love of the Percy Jackson world to my love of mythology, etc. The story is super pacey and very easy to read. I love Percy as a protagonist. He is so voicey, and it's very easy to follow him and get kind of caught up on his adventures. I really love with this story that every chapter sort of seems to be its own standalone mini story within the greater scope of the story. It makes it very, very easy to read and have good stopping points. But also you don't really want to stop because you really absolutely fall in love with characters like Annabeth and Percy, and you really love their character dynamics and the way that they butt heads and work their way through this quest. It's very much reminiscent of the quests from mythological heroes of old while still being very much rooted in the modern day, and it's truly a delight to read. I have nothing bad to say about The Lightning Thief. After that, I read about another thief in The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. And this book follows a thief named Jen who is thrown in prison after he claims he can steal anything, does steal something from a very important nobleman, and then is caught because he can't keep his giant mouth shut. Jen assumes, and so does everyone else, that he will spend the rest of his life rotting away in this prison until he's given an offer that he really truly kinda can't refuse. He'll be released from jail and all charges against him will be dropped if he goes on a mission and manages to steal an object that's quite literally out of legend for the king who imprisoned him. I love following Jen as a character. He is deeply snarky and keeps his secrets very close to his chest, which does make sense for a thieving character. But my favorite parts of this story are very much when Jen sort of opens up and takes it upon himself to explain the lore of the world via the legends that his mother taught him when he was but a youth. I think this is a very clever way to incorporate world building into a story that's quite short. At least on the surface, the story itself is packed chock full and packs a huge punch when you read it. Additionally, I like that while Jen is a braggart, we actually do get to see him use his thieving skills. Very often in certain fantasy books, certain protagonists will make claims about prowess that they have and then absolutely not live up to it. But with Jen, we actually get to see him use the skills that he describes and use them to fruition. He's genuinely competent at what he does. He just can't keep his mouth shut. And by the end of the story, you kind of figure out why all of the little bits and pieces of Jen and all the secrets that he's held close to his chest kind of interlock and come together, and you're like, oh, that's why you're like this. That's what the entire point of all of this was. And it's a deeply satisfying twist at the very end. I think it takes a very deft hand to both tell a story in first person and have the first person narrator keep secrets from the readers in a way that doesn't feel sort of stilted and unnatural. And Megan Whalen Turner does it beautifully. As far as things I didn't like, I kind of wish there were more of it, and I wish that some of the secondary characters were developed in a little more fullness. That said, I realize the story is not about them. It's very much about Jen and about the plot that he is set out on, but as a character-driven reader, I did want just a little bit more from some of those characters. And the final book I read in May was a bit of a hefty one. It was Lady Midnight, the first book of the Dark Artifaces trilogy by Cassandra Clare. This is a continuation of Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunters universe, but it takes place following different characters than before, so I actually get to describe the synopsis of the book instead of saying the whole spiel about what Clary does. The very long and short of it is that this book follows Emma Carstairs, a Shadowhunter whose parents were killed at the dawn of the Great War between Shadowhunters when she was a young girl. Her parents were found murdered by the sea with carvings and runes written into their body. And because of the chaos surrounding, the entire Shadow world after their death, it wasn't really looked into, and it was left as a cold case that everyone except for Emma is sort of content to let rest. Because of this, Emma's exploration of the case has to be kept kind of on the down low and done during her spare time, because her main job as a Shadowhunter is to keep the mundane world safe from various denizens of Downworld, with a sort of cold truce with the fairies who sided on the wrong side of the previous Shadow War. But when more bodies begin to show up that have the same markings as Emma's parents did, both human and fairy, Emma has to sort of team up with the fairies to figure out what the hell is going on, and maybe find a way to avenge her parents' death once and for all. Also, on top of it, Emma has a parabatai, which is essentially like a soul-bonded fighting partner, and his name is Julian, and the two of them are sort of falling in love, but they really, really shouldn't. It's deeply against the law, and there's a reason behind it, and things happen, and that, as you can probably tell, is very much why I'm reading the story. I'm deeply proud of how far Cassandra Clare has progressed as a writer, and how much she's expanded the world of the Shadowhunter Chronicles. The Parabatai Bond was something that I was especially interested in earlier parts of the series, so I'm very glad that we get to have a book that deeply explores it, and especially a specific taboo part of it that was of deep interest to myself as a youth and myself as an adult now. As Emma is very much a Shadowhunter from birth, we don't really have to do the exploring and figuring out, oh, this is the Shadow World, oh, these are... The expectation is that Emma already knows these things, and that as readers, we sort of have a base understanding of it too. So it's really interesting to not have an outsider coming into the world, but rather an insider sort of stretching beyond the boundaries of what is technically considered her jurisdiction. There's simply too many characters to talk about each of them and their relationships without spending a full hour on this book, so I'm going to stop it right there. Suffice it to say, I really enjoy this cast of characters. All of the Blackthorn siblings absolutely own my heart, and Julian is my sweet baby boy, and if anything bad happens to him, I might explode. As far as things I didn't like, the plot twist at the end of the story was deeply predictable. I figured it out truly within the first minute. The betrayer character appeared on page, that person was going to do some bad stuff later on in the story. But as is the case with Cassandra Clare novels, really it's the interplay of the characters that matters far more than the central plot. Also, in the first book of a series, the main baddie is never the ultimate main baddie, so I'm excited to see how the story is going to progress from here. June was a far less prolific reading month. For this month, I started with The Bear and the Nightingale, the first book of the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. It follows the daughter of a nobleman named Vasilisa. As is tradition, Vasilisa is expected to be a hyper-feminine, as we understand femininity, girl, deeply concerned with the matters of the hearth, with finding herself a husband and making herself beautiful and bearing lots and lots of children. And as the daughter of a lord, her marriage is expected to solidify certain alliances between certain houses. But Vasya isn't exactly like that. So rather than being the pious daughter that her father needs her to be, she instead is a wild child, running amok among the forests and talking to the domovoi, the household spirits that keep her family and her town safe. But when her father remarries to a deeply pious woman who can also see the domovoi and will stop at nothing to stamp them out and get them out of her home because she believes them to be demons, Vasya's home and her township is put in a severe amount of danger from a greater demon known only as the Bear. And it appears that only Vasya can stop the bears coming, along with an ally who might be good and might be bad, the Embodiment of Winter, a spirit named Morosko. What I love most about it, in addition to the truly cold atmosphere of the book, like when people say that certain books are atmospheric, what they're really talking about is specifically The Bear and the Nightingale, because it truly invokes the spirit of winter, no matter what time it is. Like I said, I read it in June. The time before that, I read it whilst in Hawaii, which is always kind of warm. And both times I had goosebumps up my arm and wanted to get a cardigan over my shoulders just to keep the cold out of my bones, because that is what the book brings with itself every single time you read it. But that's not what I'm focusing on today. Today I want to talk about how much I love the relationships between the characters, specifically the family relationships. Though they don't quite understand her or even take her side all of the time, Basia is surrounded by a deeply loving family of sisters and brothers and her father. But though they love her, they don't truly understand her, and it's very difficult for them to support her. So oftentimes she does feel very isolated, and it's no wonder really that such an isolated person then turns to this world of domovoi and spirits and creatures that other people can't see. So it's fascinating to me how Basia sort of makes a new family there, and that she and her new family are deeply invested in protecting her flesh and blood mortal family on Earth. There's nothing I don't like about the story. Go read it. That's all I can say about it for now. After that, I read Upright Women Wanted, a novella by Sarah Gailey. Upright Women Wanted predominantly follows Esther, a young woman who stows away in the librarian's cart to avoid marriage to a man who was previously engaged to her best friend, who Esther was in love with, and who was just murdered for owning resistance propaganda. Esther hopes that being surrounded by the librarians, these upright women, will fix the thing that's broken inside of her. She believes her queerness to be a sign of amorality because that is one of the tenets espoused by the society that she lives in. But what she finds when the librarians take her in is that there's more women like her than she thinks, and that sometimes they have to carve out their own places to be free in the world. As far as things I liked, just about everything in this story. You got your women loving women. You've got your really interesting anti-fascist story set in a very cool world, which, I mean, cool. It's deeply problematic because it's a hyper-fascist America that's looking every day like it's closer and closer to becoming a reality. But at the same time, the aesthetics of the Wild West, etc., are always very rad to me. And you've got a story about a woman coming to terms with her queerness without... Okay, she's got a little trauma, but her coming to terms with her queerness is ultimately a moment of joy and acceptance for herself and a desire to fight for other people to also come to terms with themselves, which is just delightful. I don't dislike anything about the story except for maybe that it's only like 180 pages long. I would have loved a full-length novel of this. Not that the story needs it, I just want it. Following that, I read perhaps my other favorite book of the year, The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This story follows Rin, an impoverished war orphan being raised by her aunt and uncle, who aces a test to get into the military academy of Sinigard on scholarship in order to avoid being married to a man twice her age and being forced into a life of basically indentured servitude. Things aren't all rosy at the academy. As a poor and dark-skinned young woman, she is looked down upon pretty intently by all of these relatively affluent people who are also in the academy with her. But when Rin learns to sort of level the playing field between herself and those who look down upon her by realizing that she has the power to essentially act as the vessel of an old forgotten god, things become a little bit easier for her at her academy. That is until the nation of Mugen from across the sea attacks, and she and all of her colleagues in this school are conscripted into the army to fight in the latest of the Poppy Wars. Then Rin's power stops being a trump card to get her classmates to stop bullying her and becomes potentially the only way to save her nation and her people, though it might come at the cost of her humanity. That's another synopsis that tells you a lot, but also barely scratches the surface of what this story is about. I absolutely love the Poppy War. You know that I love my hyper-dramatic, problematic fave main characters. I'm pretty sure we can all relate to being fueled by spite at some point in our lives, but Rin is truly fueled by something even deeper than that, a true drive within herself to be the absolute best in order to carve a place for herself in this world that has been really adamant about finding a way to push her out of it. Because of the power that she has amassed, she's not really let to make easy choices. She's only given difficult choices to make, and she consistently makes ones that morally might not be ideal on the grand scheme of things, but at the time feel like the right things for her to do. The whole story, from my point of view, was me yelling, "Rin, no," and Rin yelling, "Rin, yes," and setting the world on fire. And I had so much fun reading about her. I don't mean to make this book sound light. There are depictions of actual real-life atrocities that have happened in China, basically peppered throughout the entirety of this book. It's essentially a fictionalized and magic-infused account of true historical events, and some of the scenes depicted are truly and deeply harrowing and difficult to read about. Reality is often far worse than fiction in talking about the atrocities that human beings can do to one another, and the Poppy War and R.F. Kuang uses those atrocities in a very masterful way to depict some of the evils that people will do to one another, believing that they have the right to do so. There's not anything about the story that I didn't like. Some people complain that it feels like two different stories, one being a sort of like Harry Potter-esque girl at a new school learning new things story, and the other part being a true war novel. But to me, the abrupt change felt necessary and deeply important and tonally correct, because I feel like when war strikes, that's just kind of how it happens. Everything as you knew it ends and everything becomes war. So that complaint that I've seen around is not one that I have. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I can't wait to read the rest. When Burning God comes out, just don't talk to me, because I won't be here for several days. I'll be here. And the final book that I read in the month of June was Rereading A Blade So Black by L.L. McKinney. The sort of tagline for this book is, what if Buffy fell down the rabbit hole instead of Alice? And that's basically the perfect description. After the trauma and grief of her father's death manifests a literal, physical, walking nightmare in front of her, Alice is conscripted by the literal Mad Hatter to become one of the defenders of Wonderland and the human realm from these nightmares. She's trained by Addison Hatta to use special weapons and go into Wonderland to defeat these nightmares that human emotion creates before they can enter the world and wreak greater havoc on the people living there. On top of that, Alice still has to pass high school and have a social life with her friends and keep all of this a secret from her mom, who lives in total fear that one day Alice will be shot and killed like other Black women are in Atlanta every day. But lately, the nightmares are getting harder to kill, and after a botched putting down of one, Alice is accosted by a Black Knight in Wonderland who delivers via her a poison that makes Addison Hatta begin to slowly fade away. And she is thusly set upon a journey into Wonderland to figure out how to save Addison's life and try to keep herself from quite literally losing her head along the way. Every single time I talk about this book, I talk about how much I love Alice, and that's just because I absolutely do. I just think she's really neat. Her resilience as both a young Black woman existing in America, which, Jesus Christ, and a knife-wielding, basically savior of the universe just blows my mind. Chef's kiss. Love Alice, would die for her. But today I think I'm gonna focus a little bit more on the world of Wonderland that L. McKinney has created and the parallels it has to the original by Lewis Carroll and the differences and why I think they're so cool. McKinney's Wonderland is very much a parallel universe to our own world, and the things that happen in our world, the big emotions we manifest, have a direct impact on Wonderland and vice versa. It's very much a land of dreams that's both created by humans and fueled by humans. When Alice is trekking through it, it very much does feel like an actual physical slog to get from point A to point B. But at the same time, there's, fields of multicolored like bubbles that just exist as basically plants throughout the place. And the rulers and denizens of Wonderland, while looking vaguely humanoid, are also very uncanny valley and very much not like us. They have more power, they have more something behind their eyes. But in that same way, they also have less. They're less tangible, less corporeal. Their emotions and the nuance of those things are slightly less than the humans who've created them by sort of imagining them into existence. And I think that's fascinating, that things can be both more real and less real, that they can be more dangerous and less dangerous, and more impactful and less impactful. And going back to Alice, just because I can't stop talking about her, her ability to both exist in Wonderland, sort of as one of these people, but also as somebody removed, and exist in her own world where she's become also both a member of the in-group as a human being and also a member of the out-group because she knows about this mystical Wonderland where other people don't, is very interesting and would be isolating had she not surrounded herself with such an excellent support system. I love the supporting cast of characters as well, and I really enjoy watching them interact with Alice. As far as things I don't like, I do feel that the romance felt a little shoehorned in. I would have liked a lot more development of it to actually believe something more than a crush existed between Addison and Alice herself. I realize there's supposed to be like a lot of implied backstory between the two of them, as he is very much her hot, brooding Wonderland mentor. But at the same time, I want to see it, I need to see this development in order to believe it. And at present, I just don't believe it. They spend so much of this actual story apart that there's no room for them to develop these feelings, on page in a way that would make sense and would provide payoff to the reader. But there's more books in the series, and I'm sure that they will explore that sort of stuff in there, and I'm very excited to get to them for that reason. The first and last, and therefore only book that I read in July was The Good Luck Girls by Charlotte Nicole Davis. If I had to read only one book in the month of July, I'm glad it was The Good Luck Girls because it's a story that I thoroughly enjoyed. The story primarily concerns itself with Aster and her sister Clementine, two young girls who were sold into a welcome house at a very young age, branded with the tattoo of a flower to mark themselves as property of this welcome house, and are therefore turned into good luck girls. Young women who are sold to pay their families enormous debts to the state by essentially becoming prostitutes. But on the night of her initiation into becoming a proper good luck girl, a sundown girl, Clementine accidentally murders the man who had bought and paid for her. Thus, her life becomes forfeit, and she and Aster and several other good luck girls plan an escape because it's the only way that Clementine and possibly the rest of them will be able to survive and live a free life. But the welcome houses don't like it when property runs away, and neither do the great leaders of men in the country of Arquetta like it when their sons are murdered in basically brothels. So on their way to escape, they are hunted by the most powerful forces known to the country of Arquetta, both of the human variety and of the inhuman variety. Their only shot at hope rests in the legend that one of these good luck girls heard about a woman who can remove the brand off of their cheeks and send them off into freedom. But stories are just stories, and the threats they face are very real, and all of these girls are going to need a lot more than just a little bit of luck to survive this scenario. I really liked The Good Luck Girls. I think it's a beautifully done debut story. Like in Upright Women Wanted, the aesthetic of a sort of Wild West scenario was absolutely brilliantly done. I especially enjoyed the more fantastical elements of this, like literal blooming tattoos and ghosts being a deep threat. But more than that, I really enjoyed the realistic aspects of the story. The running away of 5 young women who desperately want a better life for themselves, turning into bandits and taking from the people who had no qualms taking from them in order to try to find their own freedom and justice in this world. And yes, a little bit of very deserved revenge. I really enjoyed the contrast between Aster, who had actually lived a full year as a sundown girl and a good luck girl, and Clementine, who was still sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and still has a little bit more hope than Aster does because it hasn't been as forcibly taken from her as it has from her sister. I think in seeing both these girls, you understand the other a little more than you would have otherwise. And as such, it makes it even more heartbreaking to see points of conflict between them grow because they don't quite understand each other's lived experiences anymore. Despite living in relatively close proximity, their reality for the past year could not be more different. These contrasts are put into even greater contrast when compared to the other girls who have followed them out. And the different skills that each of these girls sort of brought to the group as a whole, making it both cohesive and also a clashing sort of group, made for a bunch of very interesting dynamics to read about that I thoroughly enjoyed. As far as things I didn't like, it did a little bit read as a debut. Some of the world building elements were definitely a little messy, and I would have liked to have them be a little more explicated, such as the existence of the resistance groups and the knowledge of them and the size of them, etc. But I do trust, since this is the first in a series, I believe at least 3 books are going to be in this series, I trust that Charlotte Nicole Davis will explain more of this world stuff in later iterations of the story, which I definitely will be continuing with. Following The Good Luck Girls, I read The Savior's Champion and The Savior's Sister by Jenna Moresi. And I'm actually not going to talk about these books because earlier in the month I did a full review thereof and gave pretty deep synopses of both of these books, so I will direct you to that video in my description box below where you can check it out. And the final book that I read in August, and the final book that we're going to be covering in this video, is Get in Trouble by Kelly Link. Kelly Link is a masterful world builder, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading every single one of the worlds that she had put down in this collection. Where most writers tend to go when they're writing works that are basically a full split down the middle between contemporary and speculative sci-fi / fantasy stuff is by focusing on the speculative elements inside of the mundane world. Kelly Link sort of does the opposite of that, where she focuses on the mundane elements of the speculative world. She drops you into these alternate realities, alternate existences, and finds the most human story within that reality and then tells it to you. And I thoroughly enjoyed it in every single one of these stories. There's a story in here about wealthy people basically using poorer people and paying them to be avatars for their children as they grow up so their children don't do dumb shit on social media and get themselves in trouble before they can be politicians. There's another story in here about synthetic boyfriends and a girl who is deeply jealous of her wealthy friend who has so many of these synthetic boyfriends because At the heart of it, she's a 15-year-old girl who wants to be wanted. There's stories about fairies in small towns and superheroes in big cities, and every one of them just feels so grounded in reality despite being in worlds made of very speculative, fantastical stuff. Again, as with all short story collections, there's some that I liked more and some that I liked less, but overall, I really, really enjoyed what Kelly Link did with the story, and I'm excited to read more by her. But for now, that just about wraps up my quarantine reads. At least my quarantine reads for spring and summer of 2020, because we are still quarantined, those of us who take the pandemic seriously. I hope you enjoyed this absolute marathon of mini book reviews. If you stuck through this entire video and you liked it, please leave it a thumbs up. And if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to my channel. I post new videos every weekend, and I would love for you to join my little booktube family. But until then, that is it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you with the next one very, very soon. Goodbye. Oh, also, if you are a citizen of the US and you are above the age of majority and you can vote, I implore you, do so. Whether it's early and in person or whether it's via a mail-in ballot, the future of our democracy depends on it. Get out there and vote.